This lecture video may be considered in continuation of my previous video on the Victorian age and the characteristics of Victorian poetry. In this segment, I shall at first deal with Tennyson's life and then analyze the poem Break, Break, Break. The poem is prescribed in the syllabus of SKM University at the undergraduate level. Lord Alfred Tennyson, a brief biography. Throughout the entire Victorian period, Tennyson stood at the summit of poetry in England. For nearly half a century, Tennyson was not only a man and a poet, he was a voice, the voice of a whole people, expressing in exquisite melody their doubts and their faith, their griefs and their triumphs. In the wonderful variety of his verse, he suggests all the qualities of England's greatest poets. Alfred Tennyson was born on August 6, 1809 in Somersby, Lincolnshire, England. He was the fourth of 12 children. At an early age of 8, he showed a talent for writing. He wrote a 6,000-line epic poem at the age of 12. His father, the Reverend George Tennyson, tutored him in classical and modern languages. By the time Tennyson was 18, in 1827, he had published his first volume of poetry, Poems by Two Brothers. It was in the same year he left home to attend Trinity College, Cambridge. While he was at Trinity, Tennyson became close friends with Arthur Henry Hallam, who was considered one of the school's outstanding literary talents. Tennyson experienced a series of setbacks after his book Poems Chiefly Lyrical was published in the year 1830. In 1831, his father died, and in 1832, his second volume, entitled simply Poems, was not well received and harshly criticized by reviewers. In 1833, Hallam died suddenly at the age of 22. Tennyson was so shocked by the death of his friend that he vowed to publish no more poetry for 10 years. In 1850, Tennyson brought out the famous elegy In Memoriam, written to mourn the death of Arthur Hallam. With its publication, Tennyson became one of Britain's most popular poets. It is his masterpiece and most representative of Victorian age. It consists of 131 lyrics. In it, Tennyson deals with all the phases of personal griefs and sorrows and discusses the conflict between knowledge and science on the one side and faith, religion on the other. He was appointed Poet Laureate in succession to Wordsworth. He was one of the most famous and most well-recognized men in England when he died on October 6, 1892. His early verses bear the stamp of Milton, Keats, and even Virgil in a marked degree. Later, he carved an independent line of his own. During the long span of his career as a poet, he wrote every kind of poetry: the song, the idylls, the dramatic monologue, the dialect poem, the descriptive, the ballad, the warble, the epic, narrative, and the drama. He wrote on classical, romantic, and modern subjects. Tennyson presented in his poetry all the essential features of Victorian life: the ideas and tastes, moderation in politics, refined culture, religious liberalism, a lively interest in the advance of scientific discovery, increased sympathy with poverty and distress. All these Victorian feelings find expression in Tennyson's poems. Now, before I take up the analysis of the poem, I would urge you to think. Look at the picture given, face emojis with emotions. Now, some questions. How does losing a loved one affect you? Or what emotions or sense of loss might you experience at your loved one's death? Think of some words that express those emotions and feelings. Pain, grief, shock, anxiety, insecurity, helplessness, and guilty because you couldn't save the person's life, or depressed and numb, or lonely and devastated. These moods and shades of feelings pervade the poem. Now, let me recite the poem. Break, break, break on thy cold grey stones, O sea, and I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. O well for the fisherman's boy, that he shouts with his sister at play. O well for the sailor lad, that he sings in his boat on the bay. And the stately ships go on to their haven under the hill. But oh, for the touch of a vanished hand, and the sound of a voice that is still. Break, 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 at the foot of thy crags, O sea. But the tender grace of a day that is dead will never come back to me. Introduction and analysis of the first stanza. Break, break, break was written during early 1835, right after the sudden death of his friend Arthur Henry Hallam, and published in 1842. The influence of Hallam's death can be seen in several of Tennyson's other poems like Ulysses, Tithonus, and Two Voices, and of course in Memoriam with 131 lyrics. The short lyric poem is an elegy that describes Tennyson's intense feeling after the death of his friend and his own feelings of isolation while he was residing at Mablethorpe, Lincolnshire. The tone of the poem is overridingly sad and nostalgic. Now, an elegy, as you all know, is a song or poem expressing sorrow or lamentation, especially for someone who is dead. So, this poem is an elegy. On the surface, the poem may appear relatively simple, with its seaside image, complete with a boundless everlasting sea, happy playing children, fishermen and sailing boats. But Tennyson skillfully manipulates these elements to reflect and reveal his own thoughts about death and loss. The deeper interest of this elegy lies in a series of comparisons that the poet makes between the external world that he sees around him and his own internal world. The outer world is where life happens. The gushing sea waves, the sportive children on seaside, the fishermen and the boats sailing, or where it used to happen for the speaker earlier before his friend's death. The inner world is what occupies him now. Due to the death of his close friend, he is caught up in deep grief and loss and the memories of a time with the one who is gone. Now, how does Tennyson create this feeling? Take a look at the language used in line 2 of the first stanza. On thy cold grey stones, O sea. In this line, the poet makes use of the adjectives cold and grey to describe the rocks onto which the sea breaks. The use of these words sets the tone of the poem. We immediately detect a note of grief and lament that pervades the poem. The opening line with its break, break, break is persistent throughout. The repetition of break aptly conveys the ceaseless motion of the waves. Each wave is a reminder to the poet of what he lacks and also of his own struggle. The speaker appears to draw comparison here, indeed a contrast, between the powerful action of the sea waves and the relative inaction or stasis of Tennyson's own feelings. He seems frustrated and laments that the sea can keep moving and roaring loudly while he is unable to utter his thoughts. The thought continues in the second stanza also. A kind of similar distance between himself and the happy people playing and singing is visible. They possess joy and fulfillment, whether together or in company. But he cannot partake of their joy, cannot share their happiness. While the fisherman's boy shouts merrily with his sister as they play, and the young sailors sing in his boat, the speaker cannot express such joy. The poet is seized by his sense of isolation, inadequacy, insufficiency, and despair. While the brother and sister have each other, the sailor has his boat, the speaker is alone. They have reason to voice pleasure, but he does not. One might sense envy here, but, oh well, also suggests that these blithe young people have losses yet to come. In the third stanza, the poet sees the stately ships. Note the word stately, which means majestic. The ships are moving to their haven under the hill, that is, either to port or over the horizon. Whichever their destination may be, they seem content with it. In contrast, the mounded grave in which his friend's dead body lay is no pleasant haven or destination. That end means the end of life and activity. There is no more hand to touch or feel, no more voice to hear. Again, the speaker is caught up in his own internal thoughts. The memories of his friend overshadowed what the speaker sees around him. I must mention here an interpretation of the contrast made by an important critic, and I quote, "The stateliness of the ships contrasts with the poet's emotional imbalance, and the ships move forward to an attainable goal while the poet looks back to a vanished hand and a voice that is still." Unquote. Note the forward and the backward motion, which is in coherence with the motion of the sea. The final stanza, that is the fourth stanza, reinforces the speaker's sense of paralysis. He is still where he was at the start of the poem. He returns to the breaking of waves on the craggy cliffs. The waves come again and again, hitting the walls of rocks each time. But for the poet, there is no return of his dead friend, Arthur Hallam, just the recurring, unbearable pain of loss. Nevertheless, both the sea and the speaker continue with their useless but repeated actions as though there is no choice. The scene evokes a sense of inevitability and hopelessness. The poem is written in 4 stanzas of 4 lines each. Each quatrain is an irregular iambic tetrameter. The irregularity in the number of syllables in each line might convey the instability of the sea or the broken, jagged edges of the speaker's grief. Meanwhile, the A-B-C-B rhyme scheme in each stanza may reflect the regularity of the waves. Tennyson's technique of referring to a hand and a voice to represent a person is called synecdoche. A part is taken to represent the whole. Other literary devices used are apostrophe, refrain, and personification. The elegant and moving metaphor is indicated in the tender grace of a day that is dead, referring to his friend who is dead. The short lyric is replete with sound and visual imagery. The use of the long vowel sound O within the poem has varying effects. Alliteration, refrain, and anaphora add to the beauty of the poem and help to reinforce the feelings of loss. The themes of memory and nostalgia, with its strong biographical connections, feature heavily in the poem, and there is a distinct feeling that Tennyson is indeed evoking the memory of someone he has lost. If you have any questions, you can write down in the comment box given below. Thank you.